When it comes to creative industries, ideas are very much a commodity like any other. They get traded around, priced out, and leveraged. If you come up with an idea, or to use a more legal term, intellectual property that is good enough to garner masses of fans, then you can charge others to use that idea. Or maybe they'll just create some mobile gacha game that steals it while changing all of 3 pixels. But video games based on other properties have been a thing since the medium's inception. However, right now licensed games are in a bit of a different place than they've ever been before, so let's explore why that is. Though first, let's take a quick history lesson through the eras of licensed games. Because as long as home consoles have existed, games based on movies and TV shows have as well. You can take a look at any number of Atari 2600 games, like Raiders of the Lost Ark, or Ghostbusters, or the greatest game of all time, E.T. The continuous stream of licensed games continued all throughout the NES, SNES, and N64 PS1 eras, but I think they really hit critical mass during the 6th generation of home consoles, which was the GameCube, PlayStation 2, and Xbox. Because it was in this time frame that we saw the stars align in a way that created an absolute flood of tie-in games. This is thanks to the intersection of gaming being more popular than it ever was, plus the budget needed to make a solid game still being attainable for smaller companies. Essentially every single movie that came out that had somewhat of a kid-friendly slant to it had a companion video game released alongside it. Sometimes you'd have multiple games coming out for a single movie as a way of covering both the home console and handheld side of things. I really can't overstate just how prolific licensed games were in this era, and it's not hard to understand why they were so popular. Imagine you're an 8-year-old in 2004 perusing through an EB Games trying to figure out what to get. What's the more likely train of thought you're going to have? Taking a risk on a game that takes place in a world you know nothing about? Or going, hey, this game's got Jimmy Neutron on it. I like Jimmy Neutron, therefore I'm sure I'll like this game. I don't know if I'd necessarily call this the golden era of licensed games, because while the quantity certainly was there, the quality often was not. Sure, there were a few gems that came out in this era that now live on as cult classics, but the vast majority weren't much more than blatant cash grabs. Back during this generation, you didn't need a giant studio to put out a fairly by-the-books 3D platformer, which 90% of these games were. But as strong of a presence that licensed games had during this generation, the transition to the PS3 and Xbox 360 placed them into a swift decline. Higher powered consoles meant that you had to put more money into a game to make it look like it deserved to be on those consoles. The safety net of standard definition was quickly evaporating. This meant that many companies whose bread and butter was TV and movie tie-in games simply weren't able to keep up. It led to the collapse of companies like THQ, who mostly survived by putting out licensed games. During this time, mobile games picked up some of the slack left by the absence of their console counterparts, thanks to their lower development costs, but due to the very one-and-done nature of mobile games, I don't think many of them had lasting impact. However, I would say that the dying trend of standalone licensed console games did end up leading to the major success of the LEGO series. What the studio behind these games, Traveler's Tales, did here was nothing short of genius. Find a simple but engaging gameplay formula that doesn't cost too much to make, attach it to a super popular IP, and then just repeat that again and again and again. For many of these movie franchises, the LEGO games were the definitive video game equivalents. So through the PS3, Xbox 360 generation, and into the next one, the PS4, Xbox One generation, the state of licensed games was always in question. But it's been just over the past few years that they seem to have a new identity. Gone are the days of a movie getting a video game that's solely dedicated to it, and enter the era of huge, big budget, original stories set within the world of the existing IP. Before I go into any specific titles, I want to go over what it is that video games that are based on pre-existing intellectual property are trying to achieve. The first is to appeal to fans of the original property. The second goal is to be a good game in its own right. The problem you run into here is that these two goals are often in contrast with each other, and you end up with trade-offs that end up disappointing one of your two target audiences, fans of the existing IP or just fans of video games in general. Because in order to appeal to fans of the original property, you have to capture the essence of what makes that brand appealing. And a lot of times, what that essence is doesn't necessarily translate easily to video games. Take Hogwarts Legacy, for example, which I've been playing recently. I think the marketing hook for that game is pretty clear. You get to be a student at Hogwarts. And as someone who grew up in the height of Pottermania, I fully understand the appeal. Back during the heyday of the books and movies, you'd be hard-pressed to find someone who didn't want to go to Hogwarts. The flame of this fandom still burns intensely, so it's no surprise that the game has sold as well as it has. But even though I've been mostly enjoying the game, I wouldn't say it lives up to its promise of letting you feel like a student at Hogwarts much at all. You go to classes like twice in the game, and the majority of missions take place in caves miles away from the school. And a lot of what makes the Harry Potter books and movies is the banter between characters. But in Hogwarts Legacy, you don't get much interaction with other students or teachers aside from some very robotic cutscenes. My favorite thing about the game is actually the combat. It's a ton of fun seeing how you can combine different spells, and the amount of destruction you can cause is so absurd you end up falling into a sorcerer's power fantasy. So playing the game, I definitely don't feel like a student at Hogwarts. What I feel like is an evil warlock who occasionally runs through a giant empty castle. Because after completing the main story of the game and a good amount of the side quests, I can only think of one mission that really gave me the same feeling I would get from watching a Harry Potter movie or reading one of the books, and it's not even one of the main quests. I won't spoil it here, but I'll say that it's when you and two other students go searching for the secret office of one of Hogwarts' founders. And this was, I think, the quest that best delivers on the promise of giving you your own adventure in Hogwarts, much like Harry had in the books. Because, first of all, it actually takes place in Hogwarts, like the name of the game implies that you'd spend much of your time. Plus, you're with two other students, and the three of you are actually talking to each other like characters who actually care about what's going on. Because for the vast majority of the missions in this game, it's your character all alone with no one to talk to in some random cave halfway across the world map. If you were walking by someone playing this game and just caught a glimpse of the gameplay, you would never guess that it takes place in the Harry Potter universe. You'd think it was just another generic fantasy game. So let's take a look at another licensed game series, Insomniac's Spider-Man franchise. Similarly to Hogwarts Legacy, these games don't correlate with any specific movie or comic book, but rather tell their own original story set in their own version of Spider-Man's New York. Now, of course, there's the joke that every review of these games say that they make you feel like Spider-Man. But at the end of the day, that's exactly what these games are setting out to do. A good way to frame a video game review is answering the question of whether or not the game achieves its primary goal. So when the goal of the game is to make you feel like Spider-Man or Batman or any other iconic hero, if you don't address that point, you've failed as a reviewer. So do Insomniac Spider-Man games make you feel like Spider-Man? Through one lens, I would say yes. Whenever you think about what Spider-Man does, the first thing that comes to mind would be swinging through skyscrapers in Manhattan. And on this front, the game absolutely delivers. Flying through New York 50 stories above the ground feels as close to a real Spider-Man experience as any game could hope to create. But I do think that when it comes to capturing the essence of what makes Spider-Man appealing, there's a large element missing. Because remember, Spider-Man is just one half of the guy's identity, the other being Peter Parker. A lot of what makes Spider-Man so relatable and has obviously led to his massive popularity is that there's a very grounded human side to him in Peter Parker. Peter might just want to live as an ordinary student, but Spider-Man has obligations that prevent him from doing so. Peter Parker wants to hang out with his friends and go to the homecoming dance, but Spider-Man has to stop the bad guys. It's the realization of Spider-Man's famous slogan, "With great power, there must also come great responsibility." So, Insomniac's Spider-Man games fail to capture this half of the game's titular character, which is half of the appeal in the first place. Sure, there's sections where you play as Peter out of the suit, or Miles, or Mary Jane, but these parts suffer from an illness that I like to call boring gameplay syndrome. Overall, these sections feel like they were more included to pad out the game's average playtime rather than show a different side of the main character. The interactivity in these parts range from being just a glorified cutscene to straight up unenjoyable. The most egregious example would have to be the chemistry minigames, which even include an option to skip them entirely. If your minigame is so bad that you have to give players an option to skip it, maybe you just shouldn't include it in the first place. You might argue that of course sections like this are going to be boring compared to swinging around as Spider-Man. There's no way to give them equal footing. But there are games out there now that have achieved exactly this, and I would point you to look no further than Persona 5. Very similarly to the comic book and movie version of Spider-Man, the main character of Persona 5 has to balance out his ordinary high school life with extraordinary superhero obligations. And neither side of this feels like an afterthought, gameplay or story-wise. The high stakes that you have to deal with as the Phantom Thieves make you appreciate the more calm moments, like when the gang is just getting together to go out to dinner. It's a shame that these recent Insomniac games can't capture the same dichotomy, because then I think Spider-Man's potential as a video game character could be fully realized. Or maybe in the future, as the definition of what a game console is continues to evolve, a Spider-Man game could extend outside the realm of the traditional gameplay experience. Whenever you boot up any video game, you're taking on the identity and life of someone else, so maybe a Spider-Man game could work to capture that. You might be Spider-Man when you're playing the game, but when you're not, you take on the role of Peter Parker through any number of technologies like geocaching or augmented reality. But maybe I'm getting ahead of myself, and there's one more licensed game I want to talk about here, and that's Baldur's Gate 3. Because Baldur's Gate 3 isn't just another entry in the Baldur's Gate series, it's based off the iconic tabletop game Dungeons & Dragons. Now, I can't sit here and claim to be a definitive authority on D&D, but I have played it a good few times, and I think I have a pretty solid understanding of how it all works. Even though the specific rules can be pretty complex, in the grander scope, it's not that different from other more simple board games. You take turns making choices based on what's happening in the game and the actions of other players. Baldur's Gate 3 is a pretty big contrast to this because while it does have a robust multiplayer component to it, it's largely a single player experience. Yes, it uses the same combat system of Dungeons & Dragons version 5e, whatever that means, but there was never a point in it where I felt like I was playing D&D. Dungeons & Dragons as a tabletop game is incredibly reliant on collaboration and is probably impossible to play just by yourself. Plus, trying to play it solo could just be about the most pathetic thing a human being could attempt to do. And so while Baldur's Gate 3 can't fully capture the feeling of sitting around a dining room table with your friends, throwing dice in between yelling at each other, it does do its best to fill in the gaps. Because while combat is based around dice rolls, it's nice that you don't have to actually roll the dice for every single action. Instead, that all takes place under the hood. The dice roll screens just pop up for certain skill checks, like lying to someone, which is enough to keep you reminded that you're playing a D&D game while not being overly reliant on it. The characters in your party also do a good job of filling in the roles that other players might, giving you more options in combat and role-playing with much more conviction than any real human players probably can. I think the strength in this game as a licensed property is that it's not branded as Dungeons & Dragons the video game. Instead, it's just another entry in the Baldur's Gate series, which gives it enough of its own identity. It shows that it's not necessarily trying to capture the essence of what it feels like to play D&D, instead it just takes that and uses it as a base to build upon. It's not hung up on delivering an authentic Dungeons & Dragons experience. It's just trying to be a good game in its own right, which is a goal it achieves tremendously. It's definitely a difficult balance, trying to appeal to the core gaming audience as well as fans of the original property, and I don't envy any developer who's attempting this. And interestingly, I do think that this same challenge crops up on the flip side of this as well, with game franchises that are licensed out to create other types of media. The amount of movies based on video games that appeal to both fans of the game and to general audiences can probably be counted on one hand. And most of the time, these projects are fumbled so badly that they end up not appealing to either. I don't think we'll ever go back to the days of one video game releasing that correlates to one specific piece of media like we had in the 2000s. Now, it seems like the most attention a singular movie will get in video games is a Fortnite skin. Game development costs are just too high to push out a new game for every PG-13 movie that's part of some giant cinematic universe, which seem to release at least once a month. And while I've had some tough criticisms today for this new style of licensed games, I do think that this format shows more promise than the one movie equals one game thing we had going on before. It allows developers more creative freedom. Being able to twist an existing world in their own ways can lead to more enjoyable gameplay and stories that don't feel like retreads. But of course, it's what you do with this creative freedom that matters. I do hope that game developers who make licensed games like this do look closely at the very core of what makes the brand appealing to fans, and then work to create gameplay systems that bring that core to the forefront of the experience. Because much of the time, I think the appeal of these properties is a lot more basic than people make it out to be. It's not the crazy environments or deep lore or stunning special effects. More often it's things like effective character development or clever humor or relatable dilemmas. And capturing this essence doesn't need a budget in the hundreds of millions of dollars in order to achieve. So just as licensed games have been around since the beginning of video games, they'll be here until the conclusion of the medium as well. There's movie franchises that don't even exist yet that will one day be translated to games. And for any developers looking to take on the challenge of making the next great licensed game, I hope that when they're looking at the original property for inspiration, they look less at what's on the outside, that being things like the world and character designs, and more at what's on the inside, which is I think really what makes the IP special. Because while technology improves and budgets increase, licensed games can look closer to the movies they're based on than ever. But usually it's not the look that makes the movie appealing, it's the idea behind it.